Hi, I'm Cari, Senior Accessibility Designer at Scopely, and your controls suck. Probably. Input is the primary way that people interact with a game, but that also means that controls is a place where lots of accessibility problems arise. If you haven't really considered the accessibility of your controls, then they probably suck. We're still seeing the majority of games launching with fundamental controls accessibility barriers, things like unavoidable holds, simultaneous inputs, and only partial, if any, remapping. I believe this is because of a widespread lack of understanding of accessibility barriers and controls. Without knowing about controls barriers or how to identify the most impactful issues, problems arise and are often discovered too late when they can't always be fixed. And while developers jump to remapping, this isn't the holy grail solution. Listing the best practices won't really equip you with the practical strategy that you need to be able to take action, because questions will still remain like, well, what do we do first? What's most important? Or misconceptions like accessibility will ruin the intended experience. This talk aims to bridge that knowledge gap and provide a clear guide to identifying and prioritizing accessibility barriers and controls based on impact. I'll also give some key principles that I think all designers should know and consider, and also talk about how to marry accessibility and game intent, which is a personal favorite topic of mine. The content will cover all platforms, PC, console, and mobile, and be applicable to any developer who has to think about controls. From your 3Cs designers through to your UI designer thinking about your screens, or even the programmer implementing those controls. Just a quick warning that this talk is really content heavy and is mostly aimed at developers, but there's still plenty of learnings for everyone else. Now, chances are if you're watching this, I don't need to convince you, but just to give some context as to why you should care about accessibility in your controls. In Uncharted 4, 1/3 of players used the one-handed camera assist feature. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, over 40% of players customized their dead zones. In Atomfall, over 100,000 players in the first month alone modified their control scheme, and Into the Dead had 75% of their players use an alternative control scheme to the default. You can find all the links to these stats and more on Ian Hamilton's blog post for accessibility data. You can see from all of this data and numbers that there are huge numbers of players paying attention to controls, and it's more than safe to assume that it's not just disabled gamers. Looking at just one example of one-handed controls, these benefit not only someone with a limb difference, but also someone with a temporary impairment, like a broken arm, or people with situational impairments, like someone that's holding a drink or a baby, or someone that's on public transport and commuting and holding onto a handrail. I want to start the talk off with something that I've already mentioned, remapping. This is the most common thing that developers jump to when they think about controls accessibility, but it is often not a solution by itself, and rarely is it implemented in a way that actually alleviates the game's core control barriers. Remapping at any level is still an achievement and still helps, and I'm not diminishing that or recommending that you drop it from your roadmap at all. Please keep doing it. But my point is that remapping is not a blanket fix, and it shouldn't be where your conversation about accessibility and controls stops. Some common problems that I see with games that do have remapping include that the remapping is incomplete. Even though it exists, maybe not all actions can be rebound, like a lack of UI rebinding, or something like the sticks can't be remapped. Another common issue is when there's no way to remove holds. Even if every action can be remapped, if there's no way to remove holds or things like simultaneous inputs, then this still leaves a lot of controls-related barriers for players. And on mobile, you might be able to move some of the controls around, but quite often I see a lack of adjustment for touch areas. For example, the area in which a dynamic thumbstick is used. And if you can't move or adjust where that area is, then it greatly impacts which fingers or which hand you're able to use to play. All of these are things that I've seen in real games, but I don't want to call out anyone specifically, because we don't know what constraints those teams are working under. And these are just 3 examples, but they're very good reasons why remapping is not that silver bullet. So if remapping isn't the solution, then what is? How do you identify what to do? And what do you do first? What's most important? Well, first, you need to identify the barriers that exist in your game. Then you need to assess the impact of each of those barriers. Then you concept suitable solutions. And lastly, you consider the scope and cost of each. It becomes a balancing act between impact and cost. Often in accessibility, we talk about low-hanging fruit or getting the most for your work. That's when the cost is low, but the impact is high. So let's unpack exactly how to measure accessibility impact and find your biggest barriers and your low-hanging fruit. First, to identify the barriers, my top recommendation is to go and seek a range of lived experience feedback from players with various different motor capabilities. You can do this via your own user testing, use providers, or hire consultants. Alongside this, or instead of this, if you have a really small team and a really big lack of budget, I recommend looking at accessibility user stories and accessibility guidelines. Honestly, doing this first could sometimes save you time, as you can go to playtests prepared with some solutions to try out, though this will depend entirely on your timeline and your budget and where you are in development. For user stories, you would be looking for things like a one-handed player, tremors, low precision, strain, complexity, and these are fairly easy to find online if you search for accessibility user stories. For tags and guidelines, I would recommend the ESA's Accessible Gaming Initiative tags, Xbox Accessibility Guidelines, and the Game Accessibility Guidelines. From going through the various guidelines and tags, you can get a fairly comprehensive checklist of barriers that you can review your game against. Things like hold inputs, simultaneous inputs, QuickTime events, and more. You should use this as a checklist. So play your game, take all of the ones that happen, and then those are your barriers. If you go to a consultant or you do your user testing, then you may well get a list like this back where it's already the list of barriers that are applicable to your game, as well as some helpful insights on how to fix them. Once you have your list of barriers, you need to assess the impact of each one. And to do this, I would recommend questions like, how often does the barrier occur in the game? Does it affect core, secondary, or optional mechanics? And which groups of players would be affected by the barrier, even mildly? As a bonus, you might also want to consider if solving that barrier would help the game to earn any of those accessibility tags that I mentioned earlier. Scope and cost is something that you will know how to do already because you'll be doing that for all of your other features. For the benefit of any non-devs watching this talk, scope and cost refers to things like the time and any other costs associated with implementation. Typically, it does just include the development time from various departments, or any costs of third-party software or plugins, etc. In my experience with controls, this usually stretches across design, UI, and code, depending on the barrier itself. You might also consider any limitations at this point, such as the capabilities of the engine that you're using. Some engines will be able to do things much more easily than others, and it will also depend on how good your code is under the hood. Is everything quite easy to connect and read, or is it a bit hot glue and duct tape? So let's go through an example. Holding W to walk forwards. Hold inputs are a really common mobility barrier in games because they can cause fatigue, pain, or discomfort. Some players may be unable to hold inputs down due to their strength, and some players might have to play for less time because of the fatigue of the holds. For me, I have something called BlackBerry thumb. So it means that certain inputs are painful, including holds, and it usually means that I can't play for a long time holding these inputs. It means that it causes me pain for a couple days, and often it means that I either won't play that game for very long or at all. There's even options on adaptive controllers to fake hold inputs, like this example from the PlayStation Access controller, and entire whole hardware devices designed to act like a toggle, like this latch box from OneSwitch. And while you might be thinking, oh, that's great, there's hardware solutions for that, remember that this is additional hardware to buy, and holds affect many players who don't really use adaptive hardware. So by keeping holds in, you're asking players either to purchase additional hardware or to deal with pain to play your game, when they could just find a game that does let them remove the holds. So, holding W to walk forwards. Let's think about the impact. So moving your character forward is a core part of this imaginary game and getting from A to B. It is impossible to complete the game without walking forwards, and then this would affect players with low strength, repetitive strain injuries, arthritis, muscle pain, and can extend to one-handed players if the hold is needed alongside other actions. So the impact rating for this would be high. It's an unavoidable barrier that affects the core gameplay and affects many groups of players. And the bonus would be that fixing this would help to earn the Aggie tag playable without button holds. So, a solution, auto walk forwards. Put walk on a toggle. You just press a button to start walking. You control left and right movement with either left and right buttons or the mouse or the camera, and then pressing a button again while walking would toggle the player to stationary. You can find examples of this functionality in Call of Duty, Atomfall, and an unplayable game. Now, cost and scope, and again, I can't really help you with this part. There is no guarantee that every game or engine is set up to do the same thing in a simple way. And I'd really like to help abolish the comparison of game titles, saying things like, just because this game did it means that that game should be able to do it too. We don't really have any idea what's going on under the hood, or what constraints the team are working under, and what takes one game a year might take another game an hour. So my only recommendation is just be really thorough when you're doing your scope and cost explorations. Sometimes people will make something out as more difficult than it actually is. Sometimes that's because they're really busy. Sometimes it's because they don't understand exactly what you're asking for, and sometimes it's because they're making assumptions. So be really thorough, get multiple viewpoints, and involve all the teams necessary, and try to challenge any assumptions that are coming up. Obviously, the example that I've given you here is just one isolated case of a button hold. But this kind of logic can be applied to any hold in your game. For example, there's a range of these options in The Last of Us Part 2 across things like melee combos and sprinting. I also encourage you to think about all of your barriers together. Doing this for every barrier individually can take a lot of time, and it can also add a lot of cost and cognitive load in your menus. So I invite you to think about 2 questions when you find barriers like this. Firstly, does this need to be a hold, or insert other problematic input here? If so, why? If you can design out the hold or input by default, then there's no need for that option, and sometimes that's often the cheapest solution. And secondly, can this action be part of a toggle group? So think about broader options that can allow you to kill many holds with one toggle. It's still a good idea to have granular sub-options, but for usability, combining similar actions into one can help to avoid a big long list of toggles by default. And again, you can apply these questions to all kind of problematic inputs, not just holds. Now I want to take you through some key principles that I think all 3Cs designers, and anyone else thinking about controls, should know about and be aware of. A really, really common thing that I see in work in progress controls is unnecessary complexity. Just try to keep it simple and don't over-design your controls or your control options. I'm also really guilty of this. Early on in my career, I made a very overcomplicated dynamic tap hold option in my first game. It failed miserably, and it was just too complicated. So this is something that's especially important for junior designers. And I see it all the time where a junior gets a feature, they're really excited about it, and they want to make it stand out, and they feel like it needs a space on the controller, but you need to keep the game context in mind, and you need to keep your actions simple and usable. And similarly, if you try to put every single action onto a gamepad or a screen, then you're going to run into 2 problems. First, you're going to run out of buttons and fingers, and secondly, your controls are going to be so complicated that players will struggle to remember them. If you're running out of buttons or inputs, it should be a big red flag that there's something else that's wrong. So one solution to that is contextual inputs. There are loads of actions that don't need to be usable at all times, and even seemingly permanent actions, like jumping, can share a button with a contextual action. For example, if I'm within interact range of a door, I probably want to open it as opposed to jumping at it. So tricks like this can create controls that are less complicated by design, easier to remember, and easier to rebind. In Atomfall, the contextual interact 2 goes even further. There are 3 tools in this game and only 4 quick slots on your character. So instead of making you use most of your quick slots on these tools, when you also want to use them for ranged weapons, melee weapons, healing, etc., or adding in an extra button for each tool, I designed extra context rules into Interact 2. In short, when you're interacting with something that has 2 options, like a Cornish pasty, which you can either eat or pick up, then the button will do one of those things. When you're within interact area of a specific tool that can be used, it will act as a quick equip for that tool. In all other contexts, it is a quick equip for the torch. So using these context-driven rules, what could have ended up being 4 buttons, one for each tool plus the interact to, became just 1 button. Next, following in the footsteps of our automatic walk example, just automated actions in general. Automation mechanics can help reduce strain and fatigue, especially for inputs that are secondary or repetitive. A great example is in Call of Duty Black Ops. So alongside auto move forward, they provide a range of automations that make up their intelligent movement system. For example, if you run into something that you can vault over, it will just vault for you without an additional button press. This can help you get across the map from A to B with only 1 button press. Another example is Prince of Persia Mobile's Auto Heal, where you will automatically use a potion when at low health if you have one available. On a small screen with limited fingers and space for HUD, this alleviates both an extra action and extra cognitive load. You can extend this to automate so many actions in your game, from things like auto pickup to auto advance dialogue. A tip that I have is to check out player mods for games similar to yours. What usability mods like this exist for those games? And then sticking with the Prince of Persia mobile example, I also want to talk about assisted actions. For assists, Prince of Persia has a platforming assist, which lets you skip challenging parts of the game if you can't progress. Assist options, all kinds of these, from precision assistance like aim assist, through to things like infinite dashes, can sometimes feel like they're teetering on the edge of what's considered game breaking. But I challenge you with, if it's totally optional and it helps someone to play that otherwise couldn't, does it matter? For a much more in-depth perspective on this, I highly recommend Tess Grossman's talk called Cheat Codes for All. So through using all the principles that I've outlined, context-driven actions, automations, and assists, you can create a simplified control scheme, very similar to the Call of Duty motor preset earlier. This is Street Fighter 6, which has 3 different control options. 2 of them can be used in online and competitive play, which is modern and classic, and 1, dynamic, is for local play. Dynamic says that by pressing the auto attack button, your character will automatically perform attacks and combos based on their position relevant to their opponent. This is a great control type to use when you have friends or family over for a quick casual game or want to learn the basics of a character for the first time. By offering a range of control schemes, you are just allowing more people to play, and either together, like in Street Fighter's case, or by themselves in a single-player game. And you can always still cater to a hardcore audience. But just remember, if you only cater to hardcore players, that you are narrowing your audience and potential sales. That's not to say that you shouldn't, but it's just best to understand the full picture and be intentional with your decisions. And on that note, let's talk about gameplay intent and accessibility in the context of controls. Some of the solutions that I presented earlier could be part of your default scheme, and I've already mentioned that designing out the barriers can be the cheapest option. But where is the line for a feature being part of the default experience or an option? I want to go back to this slide and specifically this question. Does it need to be a particular kind of input when we know that that's a barrier? Sometimes controls have a design intent, and there are pillars like tactility or precision that inform the design of a control. A good example is a hold action that's being used for something strenuous, like moving a heavy object or using a crank. In this case, the tactility of the control is helping to build immersion because it's helping to represent the feel. And I just want to stress that I don't think that that's something that we should be losing as a design tool in terms of building an immersive experience. But when we know that that input that we want to use is an accessibility barrier, what do we pick? Both. When accessibility starts to conflict with design intent, that is the best time to make it an option. Giving an option can be the thing that enables a player to play a game on their terms. Enabling someone to play doesn't detract from the intended experience. It literally gives them access to it. Detracting from that experience would be preventing someone from experiencing it at all. To give 2 very well-known examples of this, Celeste, of course, the gameplay intent of perseverance, climbing a mountain, But options exist like infinite dash or invincibility, and these serve players who face major barriers and allows them to tailor the challenge to meet their needs. So they still experience perseverance because they can still face barriers that make it challenging and make it so that they need to keep trying these levels over and over, but it turns it from something that's impossible to something that is possible. And in Disney Illusion Island, there's a helper rope in co-op. Even though platforming is the main challenge, the designers decided that only one player needs to achieve the jump to be considered successful. So this doesn't detract from the player's experience either. Again, it's totally optional. The player who's struggling with the platforming can still try as much as they want before getting help. And the whole help and assistance is actually a really big part of their core gameplay and their core feel. The big takeaway here is agency, and just understanding that controls and accessibility barriers are not binary. It's a huge spectrum, and allowing players to engage on their terms still allows them to access the intended experience. At the end of the day, it comes down to, would you rather someone play a little differently or not play at all? And there are still ways to preserve some of the intent or feel through these options. For example, if we're talking about the hold to operate the crank, there's a gameplay action there of spending time, and you don't need the player to hold to spend time. So a more accessible version of this would be a tap with a timer. This would then preserve that gameplay cost that you're looking for, but without the access barrier of the hold. This can go a little more deeply, and I find it really fascinating thinking about accessibility and game intent and how we can provide different options that can help to provide those different intended experiences. But this is just a really simple one to get you started. So now I want to give a quick reprise to remapping. All the other moving parts that I've talked about help to build more fundamentally accessible controls, but remapping is still needed because there is no one-size-fits-all. One question that I get asked a lot is, how do I support adaptive hardware? And the answer is mostly, it just works, but you support it effectively by offering good remapping. This does change slightly in mobile, where we consider things like switch access and voice control, and you will need to use accessibility APIs to support with that. Some game engines are working towards supporting these to make it easier for developers. In particular, Unity has been making some great strides with accessibility APIs. In general, though, you should support controllers on all platforms, including mobile. And for touch remapping on mobile, you want to allow as much customization as possible for where things can go, for their size, and their configuration. Again, Prince of Persia Mobile does a really good job of this, even with very granular digital joystick to thumbstick options. So if you're doing remapping, here are the key considerations for gold star remapping. So analog to digital, so ensure that your analog inputs, so your mouse movement and your sticks, can be rebound to digital button presses for each of those 4 axes. And make sure that you can do it in reverse as well for extra points. Include the ability to remap the UI, not just the gameplay. Make sure that you can fully unbind both mouse movement and clicks, because this is vital to support on-screen keyboards. Allow resizing and repositioning of buttons and zones for digital thumbsticks on mobile. Allow anything to be moved anywhere, basically. Allow saving of multiple different configurations, and provide some presets. And by presets, I mean like the modern, classic, and dynamic control options in Street Fighter VI. Remapping and mobility is quite ironic, because sometimes in order to achieve a control scheme that works well for you, it can take a lot of strain to set up in the first place. Going through each button, changing it one by one, remapping it, dealing with the conflicts and things like that. So by providing some presets for players that are also editable, this gives them either something that could work out the box or something much closer to their needs, which needs less personalization. For example, this could be things like a left-handed version, one-handed for left hand or right hand, a no-holds preset, a low mobility strain preset, or even a one-button or one-stick mode. Lastly, I just wanted a small space to talk about some of the other standout options and examples of accessibility and controls that you can use as references and research. Firstly, game speed. This is something that's becoming more common in games these days, and this particular example is from Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Game speed just helps across the board, not just for mobility. The biggest impact that it has is in reducing reaction times and precision. To give a bit of a personal anecdote, I played through Jedi Fallen Order, which was the prequel to this game, and I could not parry at all. I 100%ed the game, but I did this by finding areas in post-game to farm the parry opportunities for those particular achievements. In Jedi Survivor, as soon as I set the slow dilation to 90% in combat, which is very, very small, I immediately could consistently parry. And I'm only one person with a very mild impairment that affects the way that I play. Honestly, this feature is a total game changer, and I would really love for it to become more standard in both single player and co-op titles. Now, this game isn't out yet, but Life Below showed off something very exciting in their recent accessibility trailer, which is on-screen buttons for mouse-only play. Obviously, I am keen to see how this is implemented, but if it's done well, then this is awesome and will probably be one of my go-to references. I think that really we should all be considering more how we can put on-screen buttons onto our games, especially as we're developing across both PC and mobile. How can we bring those mobile controls to our PC versions to help become mouse-only? There are so many good references out there, and I couldn't fit them all into one 30-minute talk, but for more research, I recommend that you go and look at some of these. FC26 and FIFA has an excellent legacy of one-button modes. Far Cry 6 has incredibly thorough remapping. Split Fiction has per-player options for QuickTime events and holds. Assassin's Creed Identity has a simplified controls preset of one stick and one button, which is on mobile. And also Fortnite Mobile has really good remapping and control layouts for a game that has very, very complex inputs. I'd also recommend that you check out gameaccess.info, which is Special Effects game information site. It has lots of videos on how players set up accessible controls in different games, and it will help to give you a deeper insight into how players modify controls in general. So some closing thoughts. Excellent controls accessibility goes way beyond remapping, and the gold standard, in my opinion, is controller support on all platforms, including mobile, full remapping including sticks to buttons and vice versa, full touch layout adjustment on mobile and touch devices, including resizing and moving touch areas, no required holds, QuickTime events, or simultaneous inputs, either by design or through options. Automation for regular secondary actions like auto pickup, assistance for specific barriers in your game, so things like game speed for timing, aim assist for precision, or combo assist, and control presets, including things like a one-handed mode and one-button modes. But mostly, if there is one thing that you take away from today, I want it to be this. Don't let remapping be the beginning and end of your conversation around accessible controls. Understand that the Venn diagram of mobility, accessibility, and game controls is a circle, and you should be considering them holistically. Every action that you make is a potential barrier, but it's also a fascinating and fulfilling area to deep dive into. Thanks so much for listening, and remember to head to the IGDA Discord to ask questions or for more resources. Thanks so much.